In a world where power corrupts and loyalty is rare, one man's journey will challenge everything he believed about duty and redemption. Throughout history, the distance between nobility and commoners has been measured not just in wealth, but in compassion. What happens when a man who has forgotten how to feel is confronted with a truth that could topple a kingdom? Sometimes, the most powerful journeys begin with the simplest act: opening a door. If you're enjoying this story, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel for more historical dramas that will capture your heart. Don't forget to like this video, share it with friends who appreciate powerful storytelling, and save it to your favorites to continue the journey. Now let's return to England 1845, where our story begins. The morning fog clung to London's streets like a thick wool blanket, obscuring the boundary between earth and sky. Through this ethereal mist, a solitary black carriage made its way toward Buckingham Palace, its wheels cutting through puddles left by the previous night's rain. Inside sat Alexander Harrington, the Duke of Westmoreland, his expression as cold and impassive as the granite buildings they passed. At 42, the Duke had the bearing of a man who commanded respect without ever having to raise his voice. His features, once considered handsome by London society, had hardened over the years into a permanent mask of detachment. He gazed out at the passing streets without truly seeing them, his mind already occupied with the day's business. "Your Grace," his driver called from above, "we've arrived." The palace gates opened as if by invisible hands. Guards in their scarlet uniforms stood at attention, their faces betraying no emotion as the Duke's carriage passed. This was not an unusual occurrence. Alexander had been summoned to the palace many times before. His reputation for executing the crown's more delicate matters with discretion and ruthless efficiency had made him a valuable asset. The grand entrance hall of Buckingham Palace echoed with the sound of the Duke's boots as he followed a young page through corridors lined with portraits of monarchs long dead. Their painted eyes seemed to follow him accusingly, as if they knew the nature of the tasks he performed in the name of the current king. "His lordship awaits you in the Blue Room, Your Grace," the page announced, bowing slightly before retreating. Alexander paused before the ornate double doors, straightening his already impeccable coat. He had been expecting this summons. Rumors had been circulating about properties on the northern estates, disputes over land that the crown had gifted to military officers during the recent conflicts abroad. Such matters were precisely why men like him existed in the aristocracy, to handle the unpleasant necessities that kept the monarchy functioning. He entered without knocking. The Blue Room, named for its azure silk wall coverings, was designed to intimidate visitors with its grandeur. Tall windows overlooked the palace gardens, now shrouded in mist. Standing by one of these windows, silhouetted against the grey light, was Lord William Pembroke, the king's uncle and most trusted advisor. "Ah, Harrington," prompt as always. Pembroke did not turn to face him immediately. At 60, the older man maintained the straight posture of his military youth, his silver hair contrasting with the deep blue of his coat. "You summoned me, my lord. I assumed it was a matter of some urgency." Alexander remained standing near the door, hands clasped behind his back. Pembroke finally turned, his hawkish features arranged in what passed for a smile. "Indeed. Please, sit." Alexander took the offered chair while Pembroke remained standing, a subtle reminder of the power dynamic between them. On the table between them lay a sealed document bearing the royal crest. "Tell me, Duke, are you familiar with a property in Durham? A small estate near the northern border granted to a Captain Henry Blackwood approximately 3 years ago?" Alexander's memory was impeccable, particularly when it came to royal land grants. Captain Blackwood distinguished himself at the Battle of Gore Pass, saved the lives of several officers, including a cousin of the king's, if I recall correctly. Your knowledge of military affairs continues to impress. Pembroke's tone suggested this was not entirely a compliment. What you may not know is that Captain Blackwood was killed 6 months ago fighting against insurgents in India. Alexander remained silent, waiting for the relevance to become clear. The property was granted to Blackwood as a personal gift from His Majesty for the duration of his service to the crown. Pembroke picked up the sealed document and held it out to Alexander. That service has ended. Alexander took the document but did not open it, and you wish me to reclaim the property for the crown. More specifically, to remove the current occupant. The captain's widow remains in residence, apparently under the mistaken impression that her husband's death does not invalidate the grant. There was something in Pembroke's tone that caught Alexander's attention, a hint of personal interest that seemed disproportionate to the matter at hand. A widow illegally occupying a small country property hardly seemed worthy of the king's uncle's direct involvement. Is there something particular about this property that concerns you, my lord? Alexander asked carefully. Pembroke's eyes narrowed slightly. Your task is to execute the crown's wishes, Harrington, not to question them. The widow must be removed, and any possessions related to Captain Blackwood's service must be returned to London immediately. Alexander broke the seal on the document and scanned its contents. The legal language was precise and unambiguous. Eleanor Blackwood was to be evicted without delay, with no provision for alternative accommodation or compensation. Rather harsh terms, Alexander observed neutrally, particularly for the widow of a war hero. The Crown's generosity has limits, Duke. Pembroke turned back to the window. I require this matter to be handled personally by you, not by one of your stewards or lawyers. There may be sensitive materials among the captain's possessions, military documents, private correspondence. I see. And suddenly, Alexander did see, at least partially. This wasn't about the property at all. Pembroke was searching for something he believed was in the possession of the captain's widow. How soon can you depart for Durham? Pembroke asked. I can leave this afternoon. The journey will take 2 days, perhaps 3 if the weather worsens. Excellent. Pembroke turned back, his expression now openly calculating. One more thing, Harrington. This matter requires the utmost discretion. No official record of your visit should exist. You will take only your most trusted servant, if any at all. The widow should simply disappear from society's notice. Alexander felt a familiar coldness settle in his chest. He had received similar instructions before, for tasks that crossed the line from the merely unpleasant to the potentially damning. He had never refused. His loyalty to the crown had been absolute since the day he inherited his title. As you wish, my lord. He rose to his feet, tucking the document into his coat. Will there be anything else? Pembroke approached him, lowering his voice despite the fact that they were alone. There is talk of unrest in the northern counties. Jacobite sympathizers who still question the legitimacy of our king's claim to the throne. It would be unfortunate if sensitive materials fell into such hands. I understand completely. Alexander met the older man's gaze steadily. The widow will be removed. Any sensitive materials will be secured. The Crown appreciates your service, as always. Pembroke extended his hand, and Alexander took it. The older man's grip was surprisingly strong. Do not disappoint me in this, Harrington. The consequences would extend far beyond your dukedom. The threat was thinly veiled, but Alexander had built his life around navigating such dangerous waters. He bowed slightly, maintaining the proper deference while revealing nothing of his thoughts. I have never failed in my duties to the Crown, Lord Pembroke. I do not intend to start now. The journey back through the palace corridors seemed longer than before. Alexander nodded to the guards as he passed, his mind already turning to the practical considerations of his task. Durham was not far, but winter was approaching, and the northern roads would soon be treacherous. More concerning was the nature of the assignment itself. Evicting a war widow was distasteful business, even by his standards. Outside, the fog had lifted somewhat, revealing a pale sun struggling to break through the clouds. Alexander's driver, Matthews, straightened as he approached. Home, Your Grace. Yes, and send word to Mills that I will be traveling north this afternoon. I'll need the small carriage prepared, not the formal one. Very good, sir. Matthews hesitated, then added, If I might ask, will this be a lengthy journey? A week at most. Alexander climbed into the carriage. Tell Mills I'll require only the essentials. And Matthews, this journey does not appear in the household records. Do you understand? The driver's face remained impassive, but his eyes reflected understanding. Perfectly, Your Grace. As the carriage pulled away from the palace, Alexander found himself thinking of Captain Blackwood's widow. He knew nothing about her except her name, Eleanor. Was she young or old? Did she have children? The document had made no mention of any. How had she reacted to the news of her husband's death? Had she wept as Alexander's sister had when her husband died in the same conflict? Or had she received the news with the same cold resignation that had overtaken Alexander when they brought him word of his own wife's death 5 years ago? It didn't matter. By this time next week, Eleanor Blackwood would be removed from the property, and whatever Pembroke was looking for would be on its way to London. Alexander would return to his own estate, to the empty rooms and silent meals that had become his life, with another duty successfully discharged. The carriage turned onto the street that led to Harrington House, the Duke's London residence. As they approached, Alexander noticed a figure on horseback waiting near the entrance. His sister, Lady Sophia Harrington, her riding habit a splash of deep green against the grey stonework. Alexander suppressed a sigh. Sophia's visits were always well-intentioned but rarely convenient. Today, with preparations for Durham to make, her timing was particularly poor. "Your sister appears to be waiting for you, sir," Matthews observed as they pulled to a stop. "So it seems." Alexander stepped down from the carriage, composing his features into a polite smile, as Sophia dismounted with the help of a footman. "Alexander, I had nearly given up on you." Sophia, 4 years his junior, had inherited the same dark hair and strong features as her brother, but where his face had hardened into remote stillness, hers remained animated and expressive. "Where have you been at this ungodly hour? Don't tell me you've taken up early morning rides through the park. I'll never believe it." "Government business," he replied, offering his arm to escort her inside. "Nothing of interest to you, I assure you." "Government business that requires the king's executioner?" Sophia had never approved of the role Alexander played in the royal court's darker affairs. "Please tell me you're not about to foreclose on another orphanage or evict a community of nuns." Despite himself, Alexander felt the corner of his mouth twitch upward. "Not nuns this time, no. Now, to what do I owe the pleasure of your company this morning?" "I'm afraid I have little time for social calls today." The entrance hall of Harrington House was cool and dim after the bright morning light. Mills, Alexander's butler for the past 15 years, appeared silently to take their coats. "Mills, I'll be departing for Durham this afternoon. See that the small carriage is prepared with provisions for at least a week." "Durham, sir?" Sophia's eyebrows rose. "What could possibly interest you in that dreary corner of England?" "Already being seen to, Your Grace," Mills replied, ignoring Sophia's interruption with practiced ease. "Will you be requiring your valet to accompany you?" Alexander considered for a moment. "No, I'll manage alone. This is a discreet errand." Mills's expression didn't change, but Alexander knew the older man well enough to recognize the slight tightening around his eyes that indicated disapproval. "Very good, sir. Would you and Lady Sophia prefer tea in the morning room or the library?" "The library," Alexander decided. "And Mills have those maps of the northern counties brought in as well." As Mills departed to make the arrangements, Sophia placed a gloved hand on Alexander's arm. "Brother, you're being mysterious, and it doesn't suit you. What sort of discreet errand takes you to Durham alone?" Alexander led the way toward the library, a cavernous room lined with leather-bound volumes that had belonged to generations of Harringtons. "It's exactly the sort of business that you've made clear you disapprove of, which is why I see no point in discussing it." "Ah!" Sophia's expression darkened. "More dirty work for the crown. What is it this time? Land seizure? Debt collection? Or something worse?" Alexander moved to the fireplace where a small fire had been lit against the morning chill. He stared into the flames rather than meet his sister's accusatory gaze. "You know I can't discuss these matters, Sophia. Not even with you. Can't or won't." She sighed, her tone softening. "Alexander, I worry about you. This path you've chosen, or that was chosen for you, it's changing you, and not for the better. We've had this conversation before." Alexander turned to face her. "I do what is required of me, as our father did before me. The Harrington title comes with responsibilities as well as privileges." Our father never allowed himself to become a tool for men like Pembroke. Sophia's voice was quiet, but intense. He maintained his dignity, his humanity. Our father had the luxury of serving a more stable regime. Alexander's tone was clipped. Times have changed. A knock at the door interrupted their exchange. Mills entered, followed by a footman carrying a tray of tea and another with a leather case of maps. "Thank you, Mills, that will be all for now." Alexander waited until the servants had departed before turning back to his sister. "Now, was there a specific purpose to your visit this morning? Or were you simply in the mood to lecture me on my moral failings?" Sophia accepted the cup of tea he offered with a small frown. "Must there be a purpose beyond wanting to see my only brother? We used to be close, Alexander. Before—" She trailed off, but the unspoken words hung in the air between them. "Before Clarissa died. Before you lost your son. Before you became this cold, distant person I barely recognize." Alexander turned away, focusing on unrolling one of the maps on the large table that dominated the center of the library. "I apologize for my curtness. It's been a challenging morning." Sophia joined him at the table, her tea forgotten. "This is a map of Durham County. Are you looking for something specific?" Alexander's finger traced a route northward from London. A small estate near the northern border. It was granted to a Captain Blackwood some years ago. "Blackwood?" Sophia frowned. "The name is familiar. He was something of a war hero, died in India 6 months ago." "Yes, I remember now. My friend Lady Canterbury mentioned him at her last salon. His widow caused quite a stir when she declined to go into the traditional full mourning. Apparently, she claimed that black didn't suit her coloring." Sophia smiled slightly. "I rather admired her spirit, from what I heard." Alexander looked up sharply. "What else do you know about her?" Sophia seemed surprised by his sudden interest. "Very little. I believe she was much younger than her husband. There were rumors that she had been an actress or some sort of performer before their marriage, but that may just be society's usual attempt to discredit anyone who does not conform to their expectations." "Does she have children?" "I don't believe so, though I couldn't say with certainty." Sophia studied her brother's face. "Why are you so interested in Eleanor Blackwood?" Alexander returned his attention to the map. "It's part of my errand." Understanding dawned on Sophia's face. "You're being sent to evict her, aren't you? A war hero's widow. How very noble." "The property was granted for the duration of Captain Blackwood's service to the Crown," Alexander replied stiffly. "That service has ended. And of course that justifies throwing a grieving widow out of her home." Sophia's voice was thick with sarcasm. "Tell me, brother, do you ever question these duties of yours? Do you ever consider refusing?" Alexander rolled up the map with more force than necessary. "No, I don't, because I understand something that you apparently do not. Our position, our privileges, even this house we stand in, exist at the pleasure of the Crown. If I were to refuse a direct order, it would not just be my title at risk, but yours as well. Everything that generations of Harringtons have built could be dismantled with a single royal decree." "So fear keeps you loyal." Sophia's disappointment was palpable. "Not honor, not justice, but fear. Call it what you will." Alexander replaced the map in its case. "I do what must be done." Sophia set down her untouched tea and moved toward the door. "I didn't come here to argue with you, Alexander. I came to invite you to dinner next Thursday, a small gathering to celebrate my birthday." Alexander winced inwardly. He had forgotten that his sister's birthday was approaching. "I should be back from Durham by then. I'll attend if I can." "How enthusiastic." Sophia's smile was sad. "There was a time when you enjoyed social occasions, you know, when you laughed, when you danced. That was a different man." Alexander met her gaze directly. "He died 5 years ago, along with his wife and child." Sophia crossed the room and placed a gentle hand on his cheek, a gesture of affection that few would dare offer the austere Duke of Westmoreland. "No, Alexander. He's still in there somewhere. I see glimpses of him occasionally behind those walls you've built." Alexander stepped back, breaking the contact. "Safe travels home, Sophia. I'll see you next Thursday if my business allows." After his sister's departure, Alexander retreated to his study to make final preparations for his journey. He wrote several letters addressing matters that might require attention during his absence, arranged for funds to be available for household expenses, and reviewed the document Pembroke had given him once more. A knock at the door preceded Mills's entrance. "The carriage is prepared, Your Grace. Your personal items have been packed according to your usual preferences for travel." "Thank you, Mills." Alexander sealed his final letter and added it to the small pile on his desk. "These are to be delivered according to their directions if I have not returned within 2 weeks." Mills collected the letters, his expression grave. "May I speak frankly, sir?" Alexander looked up, surprised. Mills rarely overstepped the boundaries of his position. "You may. This errand to Durham, I gather it's of a sensitive nature." "It is, and potentially dangerous." Alexander considered. "Not physically dangerous, no, but politically sensitive, yes." Mills nodded, seeming to choose his next words carefully. "In my 30 years of service to the Harrington family, I have never questioned the duties you or your father have performed for the Crown. However, I feel compelled to express concern about your recent assignments." "My recent assignments?" Alexander's tone cooled. "Since the death of Her Grace and the young master." Mills met his employer's gaze without flinching. "I have undertaken missions of increasing moral complexity. Missions that the Alexander Harrington I first served would have questioned, if not refused outright." Alexander felt a flare of anger, quickly suppressed. "You overstep, Mills." "Yes, sir, I do." The butler remained steady. "Because someone must. Her ladyship tries, but you dismiss her concerns as feminine sentiment. But I knew you before, sir. I watched you grow from a boy with a strong sense of justice into a man your father was proud of. A man who understood that nobility implied not just privilege, but responsibility. To those under your protection, not just to those above you in rank." For a moment, the only sound in the room was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Alexander had not allowed anyone to speak to him this way in years, yet something in Mills's words, or perhaps in the genuine concern behind them, held his rebuke in check. "Your point is noted, Mills." Alexander's voice was quiet. "Is there anything else?" Mills straightened, resuming his professional demeanor. "Only that the weather report suggests snow in the northern counties by week's end. I've included your fur-lined cloak and boots, suitable for such conditions." "Thank you. That will be all." As the door closed behind his butler, Alexander moved to the window that overlooked the street below. His carriage waited, a modest affair compared to the ornate vehicle he used for official functions. Matthew stood by the horses, checking their tack one final time. Alexander's gaze drifted upward to the sky. The brief sunshine of earlier had given way to clouds again, heavy with the promise of rain. An appropriate backdrop for the journey ahead. He had not allowed himself to consider the moral implications of his task, not fully. It was easier to focus on the practicalities, the journey, the legal aspects, the logistics of removing a person from property that was no longer theirs to occupy. But Mills's words had cracked the armor of indifference he had cultivated so carefully. A war hero's widow, a woman who had already lost everything that mattered, and now he would take the roof from over her head, all because Pembroke was searching for something, documents perhaps, or letters that might prove embarrassing to someone at court. For a brief moment, Alexander considered writing to Pembroke, claiming illness or urgent business elsewhere, but the thought vanished as quickly as it had formed. He had never refused a duty before. To do so now would indeed raise questions, perhaps dangerous ones. No, he would go to Durham. He would find this Eleanor Blackwood. He would deliver the eviction notice as required. And if there were indeed sensitive documents to be recovered, he would find those as well. It was what was expected of him. It was what he had become. Alexander Harrington, the Duke of Westmoreland, the King's executioner, as his sister so bitingly called him. A man who followed orders without question. A man who had forgotten how to feel. Taking his coat from the rack by the door, Alexander straightened his shoulders and prepared to depart. Durham awaited. Eleanor Blackwood awaited, though she did not yet know it. And whatever secrets lay hidden in that small northern estate, they would soon be revealed. What Alexander could not know, as he descended the stairs of Harrington House for the last time as the man he had become, was that the door he was about to open in Durham would change everything. Not just for Eleanor Blackwood, but for himself as well. Some doors once opened can never be closed again. 3 days of travel had done little to improve Alexander Harrington's mood. The journey from London to Durham had been plagued by unseasonably cold rain, roads churned to mud by merchant carts, and country inns with beds too short for his tall frame and rooms too draughty to provide proper rest. By the time the carriage crested the final hill overlooking the northern township of Thornfield, the Duke's patience had worn as thin as the leather of his travel gloves. "We've arrived in Thornfield proper, Your Grace," Matthews called down from his perch. "Shall we proceed to the inn or directly to the Blackwood property?" Alexander leaned forward to peer through the fogged window. Thornfield was little more than a cluster of stone buildings huddled around a modest church spire. Smoke from morning fires rising in thin columns against the grey sky. Nothing like the grandeur of London or even the respectable size of Durham City, which they had passed through the previous day. "The inn first," Alexander decided. "I wish to refresh myself before proceeding with official business." The carriage rattled down the cobblestone high street, drawing curious glances from locals unaccustomed to such fine conveyances in their modest village. Alexander ignored the attention, his mind focused on the task ahead. He had used the long journey to plan his approach carefully. The eviction would be handled with cool efficiency, firm but not cruel. He would offer the widow a reasonable time to collect her personal belongings, perhaps even a small stipend for immediate lodging elsewhere, though Pembroke had authorized no such generosity. The Golden Hart Inn stood at the far end of the high street, a sturdy 2-story building with mullioned windows and a freshly painted sign swinging in the breeze. Matthews brought the carriage to a stop at the entrance, and a stable boy rushed out to attend to the horses. "Fine beasts, sir," the boy said admiringly, stroking one of the matched black geldings. "Don't see their like around these parts often." Alexander descended from the carriage, stretching his stiff limbs. "See that they're rubbed down properly and given extra oats. They've earned it." The innkeeper, a portly man with ruddy cheeks and the resigned expression of someone who had seen too many travelers come and go to be easily impressed, appeared in the doorway. His eyes widened slightly as he took in Alexander's fine clothing and commanding presence. "Welcome to the Golden Hart, sir. Thomas Finch at your service." He bowed deeply. "How may we accommodate you today?" "I require your best room for at least 2 nights, possibly longer," Alexander replied, removing his gloves. "And a private parlor for my meals. I also need information about a local property." "Of course, sir. Please come in out of the damp." Finch ushered him inside, calling for a serving girl to take Alexander's coat. "We have a fine corner room on the upper floor, recently refurbished, views of both the high street and the countryside beyond." The interior of the inn was surprisingly well maintained, with polished wooden floors and walls adorned with hunting scenes. A fire blazed in the stone hearth, around which several locals were gathered, tankards in hand despite the early hour. Their conversation died as Alexander entered, all eyes turning to assess the newcomer. "Will you be taking luncheon, sir?" Finch inquired, leading the way upstairs. "Our cook makes an excellent steak and kidney pie, and we've just received a fresh barrel of ale from Durham." "Lunch would be welcome, yes." Alexander followed the innkeeper up the narrow staircase. "Now, about the local property. I'm seeking information on an estate granted to a Captain Henry Blackwood some years ago. I understand it's not far from here." Finch stopped so abruptly that Alexander nearly collided with him. The innkeeper turned, his expression suddenly guarded. "You're looking for Rosehill Cottage, then?" His tone had cooled noticeably. "That would be the Widow Blackwood's place, about 2 miles north of the village." "Indeed." Alexander studied the man's face, intrigued by the change in his demeanor. "You know of it?" "Everyone in Thornfield knows Rosehill," Finch replied, continuing up the stairs, but with less enthusiasm than before. "Captain Blackwood was well regarded here, even though he spent little time in residence due to his military duties, and Mrs. Blackwood has become a valued member of our community since making the cottage her permanent home." They reached the upper landing, and Finch led the way to a door at the far end of the corridor. "Here we are, sir," our finest accommodation." The room was indeed well appointed by country standards, with a large four-poster bed, a writing desk positioned beneath the window, and a small fireplace where a maid was already kindling a fire. "This will do," Alexander said, noting the fresh linens and recently swept floor. "Now, tell me more about Mrs. Blackwood. She lives alone at Rose Hill." Finch hesitated, his hand lingering on the door latch. "If you don't mind my asking, sir, what is your business with Mrs. Blackwood? She's had a difficult time of it since the captain's passing. The community has tried to offer what support we can." Alexander was not accustomed to having his inquiries questioned, particularly by country innkeepers. His expression hardened. "My business is with Mrs. Blackwood directly, Mr. Finch. I merely sought basic information about the property's location and current occupancy." "She lives there alone, yes," Finch relented, though his reluctance was palpable. "Though she employs a local girl, Mary Thwaites, who comes in for the heavier housework 3 times a week. Rose Hill is small but well kept, with a fine kitchen garden that Mrs. Blackwood tends herself." He paused. "We're a close community here, sir. We look after our own." The implication was clear enough. The village had taken Eleanor Blackwood under its collective wing, and they would not look kindly on anyone who meant her harm. Interesting. In Alexander's experience, widows of military officers frequently found themselves isolated, surviving on the margins of society after losing their husband's protection and income. "Your concern for your neighbor does you credit," Alexander said, softening his tone slightly. "I assure you my business with Mrs. Blackwood is official but not malicious. Now I would appreciate directions to Rose Hill once I've refreshed myself and had something to eat." Finch seemed somewhat mollified by this response. "Very good, sir. I'll have hot water sent up immediately and your lunch prepared. As for directions to Rose Hill, take the north road past the church. After a mile, you'll see a fork. The left path leads up a gentle hill with an oak standing alone at the top. Rose Hill sits just beyond that oak with a view of the valley. You can't miss it. It's the only cottage with a red-tiled roof in these parts. Most use slate or thatch." "Thank you, Mr. Finch. That will be all for now." After the innkeeper departed, Alexander moved to the window, looking out over the village toward the northern hills. Somewhere in that direction lay Rose Hill Cottage and the widow Blackwood. The sooner he completed this task, the sooner he could return to London and put the matter behind him. Yet Finch's protective attitude gave him pause. It suggested that Eleanor Blackwood was not merely tolerated in Thornfield, but genuinely liked, unusual for an outsider in a close-knit northern community. Perhaps there was more to the captain's widow than a former actress who refused to wear proper mourning. Alexander shook off these thoughts as the maid arrived with hot water and towels. Such considerations were irrelevant to his task. By this time tomorrow, Eleanor Blackwood would be making arrangements to leave Rose Hill, and whatever documents Pembroke sought would be secured. The widow's popularity in the village was unfortunate, but ultimately immaterial. An hour later, refreshed by a wash and a satisfying meal of pie and ale, Alexander set out on horseback toward Rose Hill Cottage. He had decided against taking the carriage, preferring the directness and freedom of riding. Matthews had been instructed to remain at the inn and see to the replenishment of their travel provisions. The road north of Thornfield was muddy but passable, winding between stone walls that separated sheep pastures from the occasional cultivated field. The recent rain had cleared, leaving behind a crisp autumn day with a sharp breeze that carried the scent of wood smoke and damp earth. Under different circumstances, Alexander might have appreciated the rugged beauty of the Durham countryside, so different from the manicured landscapes of his own estates. As Finch had described, a solitary oak marked the turn toward Rose Hill. Alexander guided his horse onto the narrower path, which climbed steadily toward a modest promontory overlooking the valley below. As he crested the hill, Rose Hill Cottage came into view, and Alexander reined in his mount to study the property from a distance. The name was apt. A profusion of late-blooming roses climbed the whitewashed walls of the small stone cottage, their red blooms vibrant against the otherwise muted palette of the landscape. The red-tiled roof gleamed in the afternoon sun, and smoke rose from a single chimney. A well-tended kitchen garden stretched to one side, while the other was bounded by a small orchard, of what appeared to be apple trees. Behind the cottage, a stone outbuilding likely served as a stable or storage. It was a charming scene, Alexander admitted to himself. A perfect country retreat, modest but maintained with obvious care. Captain Blackwood had been fortunate in his royal gift, and now, by order of the same crown that had bestowed it, Alexander would take it away. With a click of his tongue, he urged his horse forward along the path that led to Rose Hill's gate. As he approached, he noted additional details: lace curtains in the windows, a small bench positioned to catch the best of the afternoon sun, herbs hanging to dry beneath the eaves, signs of a home, not merely a house. Alexander pushed aside the unwelcome twinge of discomfort this observation caused. He had expected to take the widow by surprise, but as he dismounted and secured his horse to the gatepost, the cottage door opened. A woman emerged, wiping her hands on an apron tied over a simply cut dress of deep blue. She stood on the threshold, watching his approach with a composure that suggested she had been anticipating his arrival. Alexander had constructed a mental image of Eleanor Blackwood, based on the fragments he'd gathered. Young, perhaps frivolous, a former actress who had secured an advantageous marriage to an older officer. The woman before him matched only the first of these assumptions. She was indeed young, perhaps no more than 8 and 20, but there was nothing frivolous in her direct gaze or the set of her shoulders. She was not conventionally beautiful by London standards. Her features were too strong, her coloring too vivid for the fashionable pallor prized in the capital's drawing rooms. Chestnut hair was pulled back from her face in a simple knot, and her skin bore the slight tan of someone who spent time outdoors rather than sheltering beneath parasols. But there was a striking quality to her, an intelligence in her eyes that compelled attention. "Duke Harrington, I presume," she said, as he reached the garden gate. Her voice was clear and well modulated, with an accent that was neither common nor quite aristocratic. "I expected you yesterday." Alexander masked his surprise at being recognized. "Mrs. Blackwood, you have me at a disadvantage." A slight smile played at the corners of her mouth. "Thornfield may be small, Your Grace, but news travels fast. Mr. Finch sent his boy ahead to inform me that a London nobleman was asking after Rose Hill." She paused. And only one nobleman would have business with a war widow in this forgotten corner of Durham. Alexander felt a flicker of irritation. The innkeeper had undermined his approach before he'd even arrived. "May I come in? What I have to discuss would be better addressed in private." "Of course." She stepped aside from the doorway. "Though I doubt privacy will prevent the news from reaching every corner of the village by supper time." The interior of Rose Hill Cottage was as well kept as its exterior suggested. The main room was modestly furnished but comfortable, with worn but quality pieces that suggested they might have been brought from a larger home. A fire burned in the hearth, beside which a cradle rocked gently in the draught. Alexander froze at the sight of it. "You have a child?" Eleanor closed the door behind them, following his gaze to the cradle. "Yes. My son, Thomas." She moved to the cradle, adjusting the blanket within. "He's just fallen asleep. We should speak quietly." This complicated matters significantly. The eviction order made no mention of a child. Pembroke had either been unaware of the baby's existence or had deliberately withheld the information. Either possibility was concerning. "Please sit." Eleanor gestured to a chair by the fire. "Would you care for tea? The kettle is already hot." The civility of the offer was jarring given the purpose of his visit. "No, thank you. Mrs. Blackwood, I'm afraid my business here is not social in nature." "Few things involving dukes and war widows are," she replied, taking the seat opposite him. "You've come about the cottage. It wasn't a question." Alexander studied her face, wondering just how much she had anticipated. "Indeed. I regret to inform you that the property grant to your late husband was limited to the duration of his service to the Crown. With his passing, the property reverts to royal ownership." He reached into his coat and withdrew the sealed document Pembroke had given him. "I have here an official notice requiring you to vacate the premises." Eleanor made no move to take the document, her gaze remaining fixed on his face. "I see. And how long am I permitted to make alternative arrangements?" "The notice requires immediate vacancy," Alexander said, uncomfortable with the directness of her gaze. "However, I am prepared to allow 3 days for you to organize your affairs and find suitable accommodations. 3 days. She repeated the words without emotion. Most generous. The cradle creaked as the baby stirred within it, making a small sound between a sigh and a whimper. Eleanor glanced toward it, her expression softening momentarily before returning to Alexander. And where would you suggest a widow with an infant find suitable accommodations in 3 days, Your Grace? Thornfield has no properties to let, and my husband's pension is barely sufficient for our basic needs, let alone establishing a new household. Alexander had not expected such a direct challenge. Most recipients of royal evictions, in his experience, either collapsed in distress or railed ineffectually against the injustice. Eleanor Blackwood did neither. Her calm questioning was more discomforting than tears or anger would have been. Perhaps family members who could offer temporary shelter, he suggested, or friends in the village. My family is in Scotland, too distant to reach in 3 days, especially with a young baby, she replied. And while the villagers are kind, none have space to accommodate us for more than a night or two. She leaned forward slightly. Tell me, Duke Harrington, is it standard practice for the Crown to cast women and infants into homelessness with such haste? Or am I being granted special consideration? There was a hint of steel beneath the polite inquiry that Alexander couldn't help but admire despite his discomfort. The circumstances are unusual, he admitted. Normally more time would be allowed. However, I have specific instructions in this case. May I ask from whom these specific instructions originate? Eleanor's gaze was penetrating. Not from His Majesty himself, surely. The king has always shown consideration for military families. Alexander hesitated. Revealing Pembroke's involvement was not strictly forbidden, but neither was it wise. The order comes through official channels, he said carefully. Beyond that, I am not at liberty to discuss the matter. I see. Eleanor sat back in her chair. So I am to be made homeless, my baby exposed to the elements in the approaching winter, on the word of someone whose name you cannot even speak. Her voice remained even, but Alexander detected the first hint of genuine anger. Captain Blackwood gave his life for the Crown, Your Grace. Does that count for nothing? Your husband's service is not in question, Mrs. Blackwood, Alexander replied, uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. This is simply a matter of legal entitlement. The property was granted conditionally, not in perpetuity. A legal matter. Eleanor's mouth curved in a smile that held no warmth. How convenient that legality so often aligns with the interests of the powerful against the vulnerable. The baby in the cradle began to fuss in earnest now, small cries growing more insistent. Eleanor rose and lifted the child, cradling him against her shoulder with practiced ease. Alexander caught a glimpse of a small red face and a tuft of dark hair before the baby was nestled against his mother's neck. Please excuse me a moment, Eleanor said, her tone softening as she addressed the infant. There, Thomas. All is well. But the baby continued to cry, his distress seemingly immune to his mother's gentle bouncing. Eleanor paced the small room, murmuring soothing words that had no effect on the increasingly agitated child. He's been feverish since yesterday, she explained, a note of worry creeping into her voice. The village doctor visited this morning and left a tonic, but it hasn't seemed to help. Alexander watched the scene with growing discomfort. The practical reality of his task, evicting not just a widow, but a mother with a sick infant, was proving more difficult to reconcile with his duty than he had anticipated. Mills's words echoed in his mind. Missions that the Alexander Harrington I first served would have questioned if not refused outright. Mrs. Blackwood, he began, then stopped, unsure of what he intended to say. Offer more time. Suggest alternative arrangements. None of these would satisfy Pembroke, who had been explicit about the urgency of removing the widow and securing whatever documents might be in her possession. Eleanor turned to face him, the baby still crying against her shoulder. Yes, Your Grace? Were you about to suggest where a sick infant might find shelter in 3 days' time, or perhaps you have medical advice to offer? The challenge in her voice was unmistakable now. Alexander found himself rising from his chair, moved by an impulse he didn't fully understand. May I? He asked, gesturing toward the baby. Surprise flickered across Eleanor's face, followed by wariness. After a moment's hesitation, she carefully transferred the crying infant to Alexander's arms. The weight of the small body was at once familiar and painfully strange. It had been 5 years since Alexander had held a child, since the day his own son had been placed in his arms, perfectly formed but still and silent, never to draw breath. The memory struck him with unexpected force as the living, crying child in his arms squirmed against his chest. To his own surprise, Alexander found himself falling into a half-forgotten rhythm, a gentle swaying motion that had once come naturally when his nieces and nephews were infants. "There now," he murmured, his voice dropping to a lower, soothing register. "What's all this fuss about, young man?" Perhaps it was the novelty of the new voice or the different quality of Alexander's deeper tones, but the baby's cries began to subside. Small fists that had been tightly clenched relaxed slightly, and the red face turned toward Alexander's, regarding him with dark, solemn eyes that seemed too knowing for one so young. "He likes you," Eleanor observed, sounding both surprised and slightly amused. "He's normally wary of strangers." "Children often respond to a change in their routine when distressed," Alexander replied, continuing the gentle, swaying motion as the baby's cries reduced to occasional hiccuping sobs. "My sister has 5 children. I observed this with each of them." What he didn't say was how natural it felt, how right to hold this small life in his arms. He had avoided his sister's children for years after the loss of his own son, unable to bear the reminder of what he had lost. When had that changed? He couldn't remember. "You have a talent," Eleanor said, watching them with an expression Alexander couldn't quite interpret. "Thomas hasn't settled so quickly for anyone but me since he was born." Alexander glanced down at the now quiet baby, who had nestled against his coat, one small hand clutching the fabric. "How old is he?" "Just over 6 months." Eleanor moved closer, stroking the baby's dark hair. "He was born 2 months after we received word of Henry's death." The implication was clear. Captain Blackwood had never seen his son, had never even known he was to be a father. The revelation added yet another layer of complexity to Alexander's task. Not only was he evicting a widow and a sick child, but he was dismantling the only home this fatherless boy had ever known. "Mrs. Blackwood," Alexander began again, finding his resolve weakening by the moment, "perhaps we could discuss a more reasonable time frame for your relocation." A sharp knock at the cottage door interrupted him. Eleanor glanced toward the sound with a frown. "That will be Mary, the village girl who helps with the housework," she said, moving to answer it. "She's not expected until tomorrow." But when she opened the door, it was not a village girl who stood on the threshold. Instead, a tall man in the uniform of a British Army officer filled the doorway, his expression darkening as he took in the scene before him, Eleanor in the doorway, and behind her, the Duke of Westmoreland holding her child. "Eleanor," the man said, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion, "I received your message. I came as quickly as I could." His gaze shifted to Alexander, hard and assessing. "I see I'm not a moment too soon." "James," Eleanor's surprise was evident in her voice, "I didn't expect you until next week." Clearly. The officer, James, stepped into the cottage without waiting for an invitation, his posture rigid with hostility as he faced Alexander. "Captain James Forrester, late of His Majesty's 44th Foot Regiment. And you would be?" Alexander met the man's challenging stare with the cool authority that had cowed many a lesser nobleman in London drawing rooms. "Alexander Harrington, Duke of Westmoreland. I am here on official business concerning this property." "He's come to evict us, James," Eleanor said quietly. "We have 3 days to vacate Rose Hill." Forrester's expression hardened further. "On whose authority?" "The Crown's," Alexander replied, conscious of the incongruous scene he presented. A duke engaged in a confrontation while holding an infant who had fallen asleep against his chest. The property grant to Captain Blackwood was conditional upon his service. Henry Blackwood gave his life in that service. Forrester's voice rose slightly, causing the baby to stir in Alexander's arms. "Is that not service enough?" Eleanor moved to take the child from Alexander, their hands brushing briefly during the transfer. "Perhaps we should all sit down and discuss this calmly," she suggested. though her eyes conveyed a warning to Forrester. "Thomas has only just settled." Reluctantly, the captain nodded, though he remained standing, as Eleanor returned the baby to his cradle. Alexander noted the protective stance Forrester adopted, positioning himself between Eleanor and her visitor. There was history here, clearly, something beyond the connection of fellow officers. "Captain Forrester," Alexander addressed the man directly, "I understand your concern for Mrs. Blackwood's situation. However, this is a legal matter that must be addressed. The property is required to be returned to Crown possession." "Required by whom?" Forrester challenged. "I served with Henry for 8 years. We both received property grants at the same time for the same actions at Gore Pass. Mine came with no such conditions." This was unexpected information. Alexander filed it away for consideration. "Each grant is made according to specific terms, Captain. I am merely executing the official directive." "And that directive couldn't wait until spring? Until the baby is stronger? Until alternate arrangements could be made?" Forrester's tone made it clear what he thought of such urgency. "Or is rendering women and children homeless a particular hobby of yours, Your Grace?" "James," Eleanor's voice held a note of warning. His Grace was just discussing the possibility of extending the time frame. Was he indeed? Forrester's skepticism was evident. How magnanimous. The tension in the small room was palpable. Alexander found himself in the unusual position of being on the defensive. A duke questioned by a captain and a widow in a cottage far from the corridors of power, where his title commanded instant deference. "My instructions were explicit," Alexander said, attempting to regain control of the situation. "However, given the circumstances, particularly the child's health, I am prepared to reconsider the immediate time frame." "How considerate," Forrester's voice dripped with sarcasm. "And what of the property itself? Is there no provision for a war widow with a fatherless child? No consideration for a man who gave everything for king and country?" Alexander was saved from answering by a sudden commotion outside, the sound of hooves and carriage wheels on the path leading to the cottage. All three turned toward the window as a vehicle appeared, an unmarked black carriage that Alexander did not recognize. "Are you expecting visitors, Mrs. Blackwood?" he asked, noting the way both Eleanor and Forrester had tensed at the sound. "No," Eleanor replied, moving to the window. As she peered out, Alexander saw her face pale. "James," she said urgently, "it's them." Forrester was at her side in an instant. "Are you certain?" "The same carriage that came before, just after Henry's death." Her voice was steady, but held an undercurrent of fear that Alexander found more alarming than any emotion she had displayed thus far. "The same driver?" Forrester turned to Alexander, his previous hostility replaced by something more complex. "Your Grace, whatever your purpose here, I believe we may have a common interest in protecting this household. Those men outside are not representatives of any official authority I recognize." "Explain," Alexander demanded, moving to the window himself. The carriage had stopped at the garden gate, and 2 men were descending. Ordinary-looking individuals in nondescript clothing, nothing to distinguish them as threats. After Captain Blackwood's death, certain parties expressed an interest in his personal effects, Forrester said quickly. They claimed to represent the War Office, but their credentials were suspect. They were particularly interested in his correspondence and journals. "And in Thomas," Eleanor added, her voice dropping to ensure it wouldn't carry beyond the room. "They asked questions about the baby, specific questions about his birth, his appearance." Alexander's mind worked rapidly, connecting these new pieces of information with Pembroke's unusual interest in this remote property. "Mrs. Blackwood, is there something about your child that would be of interest to officials in London?" Eleanor and Forrester exchanged a glance, some silent communication passing between them. Before either could respond, a knock sounded at the door, forceful and commanding. "Mrs. Blackwood," a voice called from outside, "we represent Lord William Pembroke on a matter of royal business. We must insist on speaking with you immediately." At the mention of Pembroke's name, Alexander saw confirmation of his growing suspicion in Eleanor's eyes. This was no coincidence. Pembroke had sent him to evict the widow and recover documents, while simultaneously dispatching these men on a parallel mission, perhaps as backup, perhaps as supervision. Or perhaps because Pembroke didn't trust the Duke to handle what he might discover at Rosehill Cottage. "Mrs. Blackwood," Alexander said quietly, "I believe there is more to this situation than I have been led to understand. Whatever is happening here extends beyond a simple property dispute." Eleanor met his gaze directly, seeming to reach some decision. "Yes, Your Grace, it does." She moved to the cradle, lifting the baby into her arms protectively. "The question is, where do your loyalties lie? With Lord Pembroke's orders, or with what is right?" The knocking came again, more insistent this time. "Mrs. Blackwood, open this door at once in the name of the Crown." Alexander found himself at a crossroads he had not anticipated when he set out from London days ago. On one side lay the path of duty, as he had defined it for years, unquestioning execution of orders from above. On the other, something less clear but increasingly compelling, a widow's dignity, a child's security, and the growing certainty that he was being used as a pawn in a game whose rules he did not fully understand. As he looked at Eleanor Blackwood, standing defiant with her child in her arms, Alexander felt something shift within him, some long dormant part of himself stirring back to life. The man he had been before grief and duty hardened him into the king's executioner. The man who had once believed that nobility carried responsibilities not just upward to the crown, but downward to those under his protection. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said, his decision made almost before he realized it, "I suggest you take your child to the back room. Captain Forrester, remain with them." He moved toward the door, straightening to his full height, assuming the mantle of authority that had been his birthright. "I will deal with Lord Pembroke's men." The surprise on both their faces might have been amusing under different circumstances. "Your Grace," Eleanor began, "you don't understand the risk." "I understand that I am the Duke of Westmoreland," Alexander interrupted, his voice taking on the commanding tone that had sent lesser nobles scurrying in London ballrooms, "and that I do not appreciate having my official business interfered with by unnamed agents, regardless of their patron." He reached the door as the knocking began a third time. "Now please do as I suggest. Allow me to address this intrusion." After a moment's hesitation, Eleanor nodded, backing toward the rear of the cottage with Thomas clutched to her chest. Forrester followed, though his reluctance was evident in every line of his body. Alexander straightened his coat, composed his features into the haughty mask that had served him well in countless political confrontations, and opened the door to face Pembroke's men. "Gentlemen," he said, his tone glacial, "I am Alexander Harrington, Duke of Westmoreland. You are interrupting official crown business. State your purpose at once." The two men on the doorstep faltered visibly, clearly not expecting to confront a duke at the threshold of a widow's cottage in rural Durham. The older of the two recovered first, offering a stiff bow. "Your Grace, we apologize for the interruption. We were not informed of your presence here." He glanced past Alexander into the cottage. "We are here on behalf of Lord William Pembroke, regarding a matter of some sensitivity concerning the late Captain Blackwood's effects." "Indeed?" Alexander raised an eyebrow, projecting aristocratic disdain. "How curious. Lord Pembroke entrusted precisely that task to me personally just days ago. He made no mention of additional personnel." The men exchanged uneasy glances. "Perhaps his lordship thought to expedite the matter," the younger one suggested, "given its importance." "Perhaps," Alexander agreed, his tone making it clear he believed nothing of the sort. "However, as I am already addressing the situation, your services will not be required. You may inform Lord Pembroke that I have the matter well in hand, and will report to him directly upon my return to London." He made to close the door, but the older man stepped forward, placing his foot in the opening. A breach of etiquette so shocking that Alexander's surprise momentarily overshadowed his anger. "Your Grace, with respect, our instructions are quite specific. We are to search the property and secure certain items, particularly any correspondence between Captain Blackwood and his contacts at court." The man's voice lowered. "And we are to make inquiries about the child." "The child?" Alexander's voice sharpened. "What possible interest could Lord Pembroke have in a war widow's infant?" "That information is not within our purview to discuss, Your Grace." The man's eyes darted past Alexander again, searching the cottage interior. We must insist on completing our assignment. Alexander drew himself up to his full height, using every advantage of his physical presence and aristocratic bearing. You insist to a duke of the realm. You place your foot in the doorway of a property currently under my jurisdiction? His voice dropped to a dangerous quiet. Remove your foot at once, sir, or I shall have you arrested for interfering with a crown official in the execution of his duties. The threat, delivered with absolute conviction, had its intended effect. The man withdrew his foot, though his expression remained stubborn. Your Grace, Lord Pembroke will not be pleased if we return empty-handed. Lord Pembroke's pleasure is not my primary concern, Alexander replied coldly. My authority here comes directly from the Crown. Unless you have written orders that supersede mine, which I very much doubt, you have no standing to question my handling of this matter. It was a gamble. Alexander had no way of knowing what documentation these men carried, or what exact instructions Pembroke had given them. But he was betting on the power of his title and the natural deference it commanded, particularly from men of obviously lower social rank. After a moment of tense silence, the older man backed down, offering another stiff bow. As you say, Your Grace, we shall inform Lord Pembroke that you have taken personal charge of the matter. See that you do. Alexander began to close the door, then paused. And tell Lord Pembroke that I find this duplication of effort both inefficient and potentially compromising to the sensitive nature of the task. I will express my concerns to him directly upon my return. The implied rebuke was clear. Whatever game Pembroke was playing, Alexander was serving notice that he was not a passive piece to be moved without knowledge or consent. With final nods of reluctant acquiescence, the men withdrew to their carriage. Alexander remained at the door until they had turned their vehicle and begun the journey back down the hill toward Thornfield. Only when they were out of sight did he close the door and turn back to the cottage interior. Eleanor emerged from the back room, Thomas still in her arms, with Forrester close behind her. The wariness in her expression had been joined by something else, a cautious reassessment of the man standing before her. They've gone, Alexander said simply. For now. The morning fog clung low to the earth, wrapping the Durham hills in a muted grey veil. Alexander Harrington, Duke of Wessex, emerged from the village inn with his coat collar turned high and his hat pulled low, shielding his face from the damp chill. His boots struck the cobbled path with crisp authority as he mounted his black stallion and began the steady ride back toward the cottage on the hill. The property came into view slowly through the mist, the stone house modest yet proud, its ivy-covered facade glowing faintly with the light of dawn. Smoke drifted lazily from the chimney, a sign of life within. Alexander dismounted at the gate, pausing for a moment to take in the sight. In the garden, Eleanor Blackwood moved with practiced grace between rows of herbs and flowering plants, her simple dress gathered at the waist, a shawl wrapped loosely over her shoulders. She did not look up immediately. Her hands worked nimbly, gathering sprigs of lavender, chamomile, and thyme, placing them gently into a woven basket. The baby's soft cries came from a nearby cradle, set safely in the shade of a budding apple tree. "You're early," she said without turning, her voice calm but not unkind. Alexander stepped forward. "I thought it prudent to inspect the property before the agreed-upon time expires." She finally looked at him, her expression unreadable. "Of course, you're welcome to look around." With a nod, he walked past her and entered the house, ducking slightly through the low doorway. Inside, the scent of rosemary and old timber filled the air. The interior was warm, though modest, with a stone hearth, well-worn furniture, and shelves lined with simple crockery. Yet something about the house felt curated, as if it held more than it showed. Alexander's eyes moved across the room, noting the subtle anomalies. A silver medallion engraved with the royal crest hanging above the fireplace, a stack of letters bound with red wax seals bearing noble insignia, and in the far corner, resting atop a trunk, a folded military coat gleaming with medals that clearly belonged to someone of considerable honor. He ran a gloved hand over the polished brass buttons, his brow furrowing. These weren't the possessions of a humble soldier's widow. They spoke of someone deeply entrenched in the affairs of the court. You're wondering how a woman like me came to own such things, Eleanor's voice came from behind. He turned to find her holding a small porcelain cup in one hand, offering it to him. Chamomile and valerian, she said. It's for the baby mostly, but it helps with restless minds. He accepted the cup without a word, the heat of the ceramic surprising in his cold fingers. My husband served directly under the Prince Regent, she continued, her gaze steady. He was often entrusted with messages and affairs of delicate nature, far more valued than most realized. And these were his? Alexander gestured toward the medals. They were awarded to him, yes, she replied, taking a seat near the cradle, rocking it gently. He was never the type to seek recognition, but when duty called, he answered no matter the cost. The baby stirred and whimpered, his cheeks flushed with fever. Eleanor frowned, placing the cup on the side table. He's been unwell since the frost came early this year. I've tried everything, clove oil, warm compresses, tinctures. The clouds outside thickened, casting a darker hue through the windows. A rumble of thunder echoed in the distance. Moments later, rain began to fall, soft at first, then quickly intensifying. Wind howled against the shutters, rattling them in protest. Looks like the road back to the village will be impassable for a while, Eleanor said, standing to secure the windows. You might be stuck here longer than planned. Alexander stood still, silent, unsure of what stirred within him. Pity, guilt, or something far more dangerous. Curiosity. He doesn't cry with people he trusts, even if he should. Alexander looked down at the baby, whose wide eyes blinked up at him with startling clarity. A softness stirred in his chest, something uninvited. He didn't speak for a while. Outside, the storm raged on, but within the small cottage there was warmth and a quiet understanding. As night fell, Eleanor laid the baby in the cradle, covering him gently with a quilt. She lit a final candle, and after offering Alexander a blanket and a place near the fire, retired to the small adjoining room. A door creaked closed, and silence returned. But Alexander did not sleep. The flickering shadows from the hearth danced across the room, illuminating the military coat, the medallion, the wax-sealed letters. He rose quietly and began to examine them. His breath caught. The initials stirred a memory. William Pembroke. He looked again at the other items. One of the journals had the royal crest pressed into its cover. He flipped through it and caught sight of a name, Princess Charlotte, before the sound of a floorboard creaking snapped his attention to the hall. He froze. There were footsteps, soft, cautious. Someone else was awake. He quickly returned everything to its place, tucking the ring into his pocket almost by instinct. Closing the trunk, he stepped away and moved toward the hearth, pretending to warm his hands. The door opened slowly. Eleanor stood in the frame, her hair loose, a shawl clutched around her shoulders. "I thought I heard something," she said, eyes narrowed. "Just the wind," he lied smoothly. "And perhaps your floorboards complaining." She didn't look convinced, but said nothing more. With a nod, she turned and closed the door behind her. Alexander remained by the fire for several minutes, listening to the wind and rain. He finally stepped outside, pulling his coat tight. The rain had slowed, but the night was still soaked in shadows. He mounted his horse and began the descent back into the valley, the cottage glowing faintly behind him in the darkness. Before he turned the bend in the road, he looked back one last time. His hand slipped into his coat pocket, fingers closing around the ring. He had come to seize a property, to obey orders, to leave no trace. But now, a trace had been left on him, a mark he hadn't expected, and for the first time in years the certainty he wore like armor was beginning to crack. The rain had not ceased by the time Alexander returned to the inn. His cloak, heavy with moisture, clung to his shoulders as he climbed the narrow staircase to his rented room. Once inside, he peeled it off, draped it over the chair near the hearth, and stirred the embers back to life with a poker. The warmth crept slowly into the room, but his thoughts remained cold and restless. He pulled the small gold ring from his coat pocket. It sat in his palm like a forgotten memory, delicate and faintly glowing in the firelight. The inscription, barely visible in the dim room, read, "To my one true love, WPWP." He mouthed the initials as though they carried a hidden weight. And then it struck him. William Pembroke, the same man who had summoned him in secrecy weeks ago. The one who gave him the orders to investigate the Blackwood estate under the pretense of resolving a forgotten inheritance. The same Pembroke who had dismissed the importance of the widow, called her a loose end, insisted that the property was the true matter of interest. Alexander closed his fingers slowly around the ring. He sat for hours in contemplation, the crackling fire a companion to the silence. The more he thought, the more the pieces began to tremble and shift, unsettling, like loose stones in a foundation he had once trusted completely. By morning, he was already on the road back to London. The capital greeted him with the usual grey skies and an endless rhythm of horses, voices and carriages echoing off stone buildings. Alexander went first to his townhouse in Kensington, where the staff greeted him with cautious curiosity. He brushed off questions about his journey and went directly to his chambers to change, then made his way across town to visit the only person he trusted with unfiltered questions, his sister, Sophia. Lady Sophia Harrington was the image of refined rebellion. Though her gowns were the latest fashion, her mind was razor-sharp, and her curiosity for courtly affairs often outmatched even the most seasoned gossipers. She lived in a well-kept apartment just above a bookseller near Grosvenor Square, where she hosted salons of poets and philosophers by candlelight. When Alexander arrived, she was seated by the window, her hands deep in embroidery, the thread moving with practiced elegance. "Well, well," she said, arching a brow as he entered, "the wandering duke returns." "I need to ask you something," he said, wasting no time. "You rarely come here without reason. Sit, speak." Alexander removed his gloves, placed his hat on the table and sat across from her. "Tell me what you know about William Pembroke." Sophia paused. Her needle hovered in the air for a beat too long. "That name has not graced these walls in some time," she said carefully. "Why?" "Because I've been working under his orders, or so I thought. Something about the Blackwood property. But now, things no longer align." Sophia exhaled, setting her embroidery aside. "Pembroke has a reputation. Officially, he's still attached to the Privy Council, but he's rarely seen in public these days. After what happened last year, I'm surprised he has the nerve to show his face at all." Alexander leaned forward. "What happened?" She looked around as if the walls might lean in to hear. There were whispers about a liaison with a young noblewoman, someone close to the court. She vanished, quietly, discreetly. The palace claimed she went abroad for health reasons, but those who paid attention knew better. He felt a chill stir at the base of his neck. "Do you know her name?" Sophia hesitated. "No one ever confirmed it, but I do recall she was often seen in the company of a Captain Blackwood, tall, decorated, fought in the colonies. Her family disapproved of the match, but she followed him anyway, and then they both vanished." Alexander's stomach turned. Sophia watched him carefully. "Why are you asking this now?" He opened his hand and placed the ring between them. Sophia picked it up, read the inscription, and looked at him with widening eyes. "WP." He nodded. "Found it hidden in the Blackwood home." Sophia sat back, thoughtful. Then the story was true, and worse. It was covered up. Before he could speak again, there was a knock at the door. A maid entered, holding a small silver tray. "A message arrived for you, Your Grace. Urgent." From your residence. Alexander took the envelope, recognizing the seal of his personal steward. He broke the wax and read quickly. His expression hardened. "What is it?" Sophia asked. "Someone came looking for me. A man the staff didn't recognize. He asked about Durham, about the mission." "Did they say what he looked like?" "No, only that he didn't give his name. But he left this." Alexander pulled a second folded slip from the envelope, a hastily scribbled note in unfamiliar handwriting. "They know what you found. Tread carefully." He stood abruptly. "I need to return home." "Alex, be careful," Sophia said, her voice dropping into something rare. Fear. "If this touches Pembroke, you're treading into dangerous waters." "I'm already drowning," he said grimly. Meanwhile, in Durham, the storm had passed, leaving the fields soaked and the air heavy with silence. Eleanor moved through the cottage with a practiced grace, her mind drifting. She had barely slept since the Duke left, unsure of what he'd seen or what he might have taken. She was still tending to the herbs when she heard the knock at the back door. 3 quick raps, then one slow. A signal. She opened the door without hesitation. Captain Forrester stepped inside, dripping with rain, his uniform muddied from travel. He was lean, weathered, and bore the look of a man who had learned to trust few things, including time. "You've been found," he said without preamble. There was movement in London. Eyes turned toward Durham again. "They know the Duke visited." Eleanor glanced toward the cradle where her son slept. "He didn't act. He could have taken me. He didn't." Forrester's voice softened, but his urgency remained. "Hesitation doesn't make him an ally. We can't afford mistakes. Not now. I need more time." "There is no more time," he said. "The network is compromised. If you stay, you endanger yourself and the child." Eleanor's voice dropped. "The child is why I must stay." Forrester took a step closer, lowering his voice. "Is he the reason? Or is it him?" Eleanor didn't answer. The candle flickered between them as the wind hissed at the windows. Back in London, Alexander paced the library of his home. Rows of leather-bound volumes surrounded him: history, law, genealogy. But it was one small, tattered registry that caught his attention. A clerical log of marriages performed without formal announcement, recorded quietly for posterity. He ran his finger down the column of names, and there it was. Eleanor Rose Marin, wed to Captain William Blackwood. Date 14 months ago. Witnessed only by the chaplain and one unnamed nobleman. He sank into the chair beside him. Eleanor was not merely a widow. She had been someone. She was someone. And William Pembroke had lied. The room darkened as evening came. Outside, thunder once again rolled over London, but inside the storm had already begun. The sky over Durham was a muted canvas of grey and lilac when Alexander returned, unannounced and unaccompanied. His carriage wheels cut silently through the wet gravel, and as the old house came into view once more, a strange mix of dread and resolve stirred inside him. There was no certainty in his purpose, only questions, and the ring in his pocket that felt heavier with every mile. He stepped down from the carriage and approached the door, but it was already ajar. Inside, the house was in quiet disarray. Trunks stood open. Fabrics were folded hastily. Shelves had been stripped of books, and in the drawing room, a few chairs were covered with linen cloths. The air smelled faintly of lavender and damp wood. Eleanor was in the middle of the room, folding a shawl when she saw him. She froze. "I believed you would give me 3 days," she said calmly, though her voice trembled just enough to betray her. "I didn't come to evict you," Alexander replied, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. "At least, not yet." She turned back to her trunk. "Then, why are you here?" He reached into his coat and withdrew the ring. It caught the light softly, the inscription now familiar to both of them. "I found this hidden in your home. I know who it belonged to. I want the truth." Eleanor's eyes lingered on the ring. Her fingers tightened on the fabric in her hands. The room fell quiet, as though holding its breath. She didn't speak for several moments. Then softly she said, "He was a good man, a brave one, but he wasn't the child's father." Alexander said nothing. He let the silence do what interrogation never could. Eleanor looked down. I met William Blackwood through Lord Pembroke. I was involved with someone I shouldn't have been. When I discovered I was with child, I was told to disappear, to vanish, for the sake of the crown. She moved to the cradle and touched the soft blanket that lay over the child. Captain Blackwood offered me sanctuary. He married me not out of love but duty, to protect me and the baby. Who was the father? Alexander asked, his voice firmer now. Before she could answer, a sudden crash echoed from the hallway, a boot against wood. Alexander turned swiftly, but the sound was already upon them. A man stepped into the room, soaked from the rain and breathing heavily. His dark coat clung to his frame and his pistol was drawn, aimed directly at Alexander. "Step away from her," the man barked. Alexander didn't flinch. "Captain Forrester, I presume. You know my name, then you know this isn't your concern." Eleanor moved quickly between them. "Please don't. He hasn't harmed me." "He's here because of Pembroke," Forrester snapped. "You think he's different, but he's just another dog sent to take the boy." Alexander raised his hands. "I didn't come to take anything. I came to understand. Because someone is lying to all of us, and I no longer know who that is." Forrester's hand trembled, but not from fear, from anger, from exhaustion, from months of watching, hiding, running. "Pembroke sent others before you," he said, "men in uniform, in disguise. One nearly took the child in the dead of night. I stopped him. Another came dressed as a merchant. I buried him in the forest." Eleanor closed her eyes. "He's telling the truth. We've been hunted since the moment we left the court." Alexander lowered his voice. "What is it about this child that frightens Pembroke so deeply?" There was a long silence. Eleanor walked to the cradle and lifted the infant gently. The child stirred, yawned, and nestled against her shoulder. She turned, holding him close. "Because this child," she said, her voice breaking, "is not mine alone, and he's not Captain Blackwood's." Alexander felt the room tilt slightly. "Then who?" Eleanor looked at him with eyes that seemed to age a decade in a single breath. "He is the son of Edward, the former Prince Regent." The name struck like thunder through the air. Alexander stepped back as if pushed. "That's impossible. The Regent died a year ago. There were no heirs, no acknowledged ones." "No public ones," Eleanor corrected. She sat down slowly, the baby still in her arms, her fingers trembling as she stroked his back. "We were lovers in secret. He told me it would never be allowed, that his father would disown him if it became known. But he swore he'd find a way. Then he fell ill rapidly, suspiciously, and before I could see him again, he was gone." Forrester lowered the pistol slightly but did not holster it. His eyes were fixed on Alexander, studying every breath, every reaction. Alexander sat down opposite them, reeling but steady. "If what you say is true, then this child has a claim to the throne, a stronger one than the current line." Eleanor nodded. "That's why Pembroke wants him silenced. He would rather burn down the line of succession than let the truth be known." Alexander looked at the child, peaceful, unaware, oblivious to the firestorm around him. "And you? What do you want?" Eleanor's eyes welled with tears. "I want him to live, to be free, not as a prince, not as a symbol, just as a boy who might know kindness, safety, and maybe one day, truth." The rain beat harder on the windows. Captain Forrester finally lowered his weapon fully. "You've seen now," he said to Alexander, "so the question is, what will you do with what you know?" Alexander leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I don't serve Pembroke," he said. "Not anymore, but if you think you can hide this child forever, you're wrong. Secrets this large don't stay buried, especially not royal ones." Eleanor's voice was barely a whisper. "Then help us, not to make him king, but to make sure he sees his 5th birthday." Alexander looked at her, then at the child. He saw not a threat, not a political weapon, but a fragile life clinging to the edge of a crumbling lie. A life born of forbidden love, orphaned by power, and now hunted by men who believed the crown meant more than innocence. He stood. "I'll return to London," he said. "I need time, and I need to know who else knows." He turned to Forrester. "Keep them hidden. Use a new location, somewhere off every map." Forrester nodded once. As Alexander reached the door, Eleanor spoke one last time. "His name is Thomas." He paused. She held the child a little closer. Thomas Edward, after his father. Alexander offered no reply. He stepped out into the rain, into the gathering dusk, his thoughts louder than the storm. Behind him, within those cottage walls, lay the future of a nation, wrapped in linen, cradled in love, and born of treason. And ahead of him waited a reckoning. The wind whispered through the cracks in the shutters, and the candle between them trembled with every gust. The small sitting room, dimly lit and stripped of all luxuries, had become something else entirely. A confessional. Eleanor sat near the hearth, Thomas nestled in her arms, sleeping peacefully despite the weight of the secrets that surrounded him. Captain Forrester stood by the window, pistol tucked at his hip, one eye on the storm and the other on Alexander. It was Eleanor who broke the silence, her voice low and steady. "I suppose it's time you heard everything." Alexander, seated opposite her, didn't interrupt. His mind was already reeling from what had been said hours earlier, but something in her tone suggested the truth went deeper still. "I wasn't just a lady of leisure," Eleanor began. "I served as a companion to Princess Charlotte. I was there at her side during the final years of her life. I saw how lonely she was, how stifled by the expectations of the court." Alexander leaned forward slightly, drawn in. "She confided in me," Eleanor continued, "about her secret courtship with a young officer, about how the king forbade the match, about the child she carried in silence." Alexander frowned. "The history books say she died in childbirth. The entire nation mourned. There was no heir." Eleanor nodded. "Because that's what they were told to believe. But the real story is far more tragic." She adjusted Thomas in her arms, then looked directly at Alexander. "She gave birth in secret, months before the official announcement of her pregnancy. The child was born early, yes, but alive and strong. A boy." Alexander's voice dropped to a whisper. "This boy?" She nodded. "He was spirited away the night of his birth. Only a few knew the truth, her doctor, myself, 2 guards, and Lord Pembroke." Alexander stiffened at the name. "Pembroke had ambitions," she said. "He wanted the throne for his own blood, his sister's son, Edward's cousin. A boy who would be easy to mold, manageable, obedient." Captain Forrester stepped forward now, adding his voice to the tale. "Blackwood and I were on duty that night. We were loyal to the crown, not to Pembroke. When we realized what was happening, how Pembroke was orchestrating her death, we acted. We faked an escape," Eleanor said. "Princess Charlotte gave me the child herself. Her final command to me was to protect him at any cost." Alexander could hardly breathe. "But she did die," he said, trying to reconcile the story. "She passed in childbirth. That's historical fact." Eleanor's eyes darkened. "She died weeks later. From complications, yes, but not during the birth. She was kept hidden while Pembroke arranged the lie. They waited to announce her labor until she was already gone. Then they staged a miscarriage." "It was masterfully done," Forrester said. "No one questioned it, not the servants, not the people." "And the child?" Alexander asked, barely recognizing the sound of his own voice. "Was renamed, hidden, given to a false husband to raise as his own." Alexander stood, pacing now. His mind raced through every lesson, every royal decree, every quiet moment in court where whispers could have told this story but didn't. "Why hasn't Pembroke killed the child?" he asked. "Why this long campaign of shadow and whispers?" "Because the king suspects," Eleanor replied. "He never fully believed the story, and he has refused to formally name a successor, fearing that the true heir might one day be found. If Thomas were to die now, under suspicious circumstances, it would raise more questions than answers. Pembroke needs the child to vanish without trace, without scandal. A tragic accident, a house fire, a sickness no one could explain." "And I," Alexander murmured, realization dawning, "was the perfect scapegoat." Eleanor's gaze didn't waver. "You were. A nobleman sent under official orders, close enough to observe, distant enough to blame." Alexander sat again, his hands clasped before him. The pieces clicked together like stones in a grave. "They never intended for me to return," he whispered. "Even if I obeyed orders, even if I removed you quietly, they would have buried me beside you and told the court I died in the line of duty." Forrester nodded grimly. That's what Pembroke does. He uses loyalty like a dagger. You've served him. You know it. Alexander looked at Thomas. The child shifted gently in his sleep, unaware of the blood and politics wrapped around his birth. He's the true heir, Alexander said, tasting the words. The last legitimate descendant of Charlotte, of the king. Eleanor nodded. And if he lives long enough to speak, Forrester added, he could change the course of a kingdom. The room fell silent again. Outside, the rain softened into a whisper. The candle sputtered. Alexander stood. His expression was no longer clouded by doubt. We can't stay here, he said. Not another day. Eleanor looked up, startled. It's too exposed. If Pembroke suspects I know the truth, they'll come. Tonight, tomorrow, soon. But where will we go? She asked. We've already moved so many times. There's nowhere left. There is, Alexander replied. A place no one would look. A private estate in Northumberland. Remote, forgotten. I inherited it from my uncle, but haven't set foot there in years. Forrester raised an eyebrow. Can it be secured? I'll send word ahead through a trusted friend. There are servants who owe me favors. It won't be easy, but it will be safer than this. Eleanor's eyes filled again, but this time with something close to hope. Alexander crossed to her and knelt beside the chair. I don't know what this child will become. I don't know if we're protecting a boy or shaping a king. But I do know I won't be a pawn in someone else's lie. He reached out and gently touched Thomas's tiny hand. We'll protect him. Together. Forrester exhaled and moved toward the door. I'll fetch the horses. As he disappeared into the night, Eleanor stood, cradling the child. You've changed, she said softly. Alexander looked up at her. No, I've just remembered who I am. She smiled faintly. The storm outside was fading, but the true tempest had only just begun. The moon was barely more than a sliver, as the carriage rolled away from the Durham estate under a veil of darkness. Hooves muffled by wet earth and wheels creaking softly over the uneven road, the group moved in near silence, each lost in thought, each aware that every mile brought both hope and risk. Alexander sat at the reins, his hands tight on the leather straps. Beside him, Captain Forrester kept a sharp eye on the road ahead, musket within easy reach. Inside the covered compartment, Eleanor cradled Thomas against her chest, swaying gently with the motion of the carriage. They had left behind everything familiar. There would be no returning the same way. For the first hour, no one spoke. The only sounds were the steady clip of the horses and the occasional rustle of wind through the hedgerows. It wasn't until they turned onto a narrow path, overgrown and half forgotten, that Alexander finally broke the silence. When I was a boy, he said, almost absently, my father used to bring us to this very road. He claimed it led nowhere useful. He called it a road for ghosts. Forrester gave a grunt. Ghosts are preferable to soldiers. Alexander almost smiled. Eleanor's voice came softly from the back. Your father, what was he like? He hesitated, then answered, eyes still on the shadows ahead. Honorable, stern, the kind of man who kept his word, even when it ruined him. I remember thinking him cold, but now, I wonder if it was simply the weight he carried. Eleanor shifted Thomas gently and asked, and your mother? She died young. Fever. A pause. I had a sister, Sophia. She survived. Married well, but I never quite followed the same path. After the war, after my return, something in me stopped caring. Eleanor's gaze lingered on him. Stopped caring about what? Alexander didn't answer immediately. He adjusted the reins, eyes distant. About anything. Anyone. I buried myself in politics, in service, in orders. Life became simple that way. She nodded slowly. And now? He looked back, briefly meeting her eyes in the dim lantern light. Now I find myself committing treason for a woman I hardly know, and a child who may yet change the course of England as history. I suppose something has changed. Eleanor held his gaze for a moment longer, then turned her attention back to Thomas. Or perhaps, she whispered, you've simply remembered who you once were. The journey stretched on through the night, winding over forgotten back roads and forest trails. Twice they were forced to hide at the sound of distant hooves, possibly patrols, possibly worse. But luck or fate seemed to be on their side. Just before dawn, they arrived. Nestled deep within the woods of Northumberland stood the old hunting lodge of the Fairchild family, built of stone and timber, with ivy curling around the corners and moss blanketing the roof. It looked more like a memory than a dwelling. Alexander dismounted first, striding toward the heavy oak door. It creaked open with effort, revealing a dusty but sturdy interior. A hearth cold for years, rugs faded, furniture draped in sheets. Forrester cleared the rooms methodically, while Alexander lit the fireplace. Eleanor stepped inside, clutching Thomas tightly, her eyes scanning the shadows. "It's perfect," she whispered. "No one would think to search here." Alexander nodded. "It hasn't seen company in years. Most don't even know it belongs to me." Within the hour, they had swept away the worst of the dust, lit the lamps, and brought the house back to life in some modest way. Forrester took position near the perimeter, scouting the nearby woods and setting simple traps to alert them of unwanted visitors. Inside, Alexander and Eleanor sat near the fire, Thomas asleep between them. "So," Alexander said, rubbing a hand over his jaw, "what's our next move?" Eleanor glanced toward the baby, then met his eyes. "You said we need proof, undeniable evidence of Thomas's birth and lineage." "You're right. Without it, all of this is just stories and secrets." Alexander nodded slowly. "And you believe this proof exists?" She exhaled. "There is a journal. The Princess Charlotte kept it during her final year. It details the pregnancy, her fears, her hopes for the child. And there is also a birth record, a real one, signed by her physician. Both were hidden by my husband before he died." Alexander frowned. "Where?" "In a compartment beneath the floorboards of our bedroom in Durham. It's not something easily stumbled upon. Only I and Captain Forrester knew." He looked into the fire, jaw tightening. "If I return now, they'll be watching. Pembroke will assume I've betrayed him, or worse, that I've aligned myself with you." She placed a gentle hand on his arm. "You don't have to go." He met her gaze. "I'm the only one who can. If I send Forrester, they'll see a soldier. If I send you, they'll take you." He stood. "Alone, I still have some credibility. They won't expect me to return so soon." Eleanor stood too. "It's too dangerous." He placed a hand over hers. "It's necessary." The fire crackled between them. Outside, the woods whispered with morning breeze. Forrester returned a moment later, nodding in silent approval of the perimeter. "We're secure for now," he said. Then, noticing the tension in the room, he added, "What's happened?" "I'm going back," Alexander said simply. Forrester raised a brow. "To Durham?" "To retrieve the journal and the certificate." Forrester looked at Eleanor, then back to Alexander. "You'll be watched." "I know." "Then I'm coming with you." "No," Alexander said. "You're needed here. If anything happens to me, they'll need you." Eleanor stepped forward, her voice firm. "You won't go alone without a plan. We'll prepare a route, codes, something." Alexander smiled faintly. Always so practical. She didn't return the smile. Her eyes were filled with something else. Fear, unspoken affection, perhaps both. He took her hand again, briefly, then turned to gather his things. Within the hour, a single horse was prepared. The road was planned, avoiding towns, avoiding bridges where soldiers might post. Forrester marked alternate trails on a map, noting safe places to rest if needed. As the sun dipped low again and the shadows lengthened, Alexander stood at the edge of the clearing, ready to leave. Eleanor approached him, Thomas cradled in her arms. "You've already done more than I could have asked," she said softly. He reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. "This isn't for you," he said. "It's for him." Then he turned, mounted the horse, and without another word, vanished into the gathering night. Eleanor stood watching long after he disappeared, clutching the child to her chest, her heart pulled between hope and dread. The streets of Durham were hushed under the weight of midnight fog as Alexander rode in, his cloak drawn tight and his hood pulled low. He approached the familiar outline of the house with caution, dismounting at a distance and leading the horse the rest of the way on foot. No lanterns burned in the windows, no movement stirred. But something felt wrong. As he crossed the threshold of the cottage, his suspicions were confirmed. The door hung slightly ajar, the lock splintered. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of smoke and overturned earth. Furniture had been tossed aside, drawers emptied, cushions slit. The floorboards were scarred as if blades had been used to pry between them. They had been here, Pembroke's men. Alexander's eyes scanned the room with urgency. If they had found what he was looking for, it was over. But as he stepped carefully into the parlor, he remembered Eleanor's words. Not easily stumbled upon. He knelt before the fireplace. The ash was cold. He swept it aside, revealing the iron grate, then reached for the loose stone just to the right of the hearth. With some effort, he dislodged it. Beneath it lay a shallow cavity carved into the foundation, and inside, still untouched, was a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. His breath caught. Carefully, he unwrapped it. A leather-bound book, worn at the edges, with the royal seal barely legible on the first page, the personal journal of Princess Charlotte. Alongside it, a folded parchment bearing the unmistakable mark of the royal physician, the birth certificate. He secured both beneath his coat, binding them tightly to his waist. Then, rising to his feet, he prepared to leave. But it was already too late. A sound outside, the crunch of boots on gravel. Voices. Alexander moved to the window. Torches glowed in the mist. Soldiers, half a dozen at least, fanning out around the house, and at the center of them, mounted and unmistakable, was the man himself. Lord William Pembroke. Alexander's heart pounded, but he forced calm upon himself. He stepped to the back door, but before he could touch the handle, it burst open with a crash. Steel gleamed. A voice rang out. "Drop your weapons, Lord Harrington." He turned slowly, hands raised, as two guards advanced with pistols drawn. Pembroke stepped into the room moments later, his expression as cold and sharp as a blade. "Where is the child, Harrington?" he demanded. Alexander's voice was level. "What child? Don't insult me." Pembroke's lip curled. "For you were seen helping the woman, you've gone soft. Or worse, sentimental." "I returned to ensure the property was empty as instructed," Alexander replied evenly. "That is all." Pembroke's eyes narrowed. He stepped forward, eyes scanning Alexander's coat, his belt, the faint bulge beneath the fabric. "You always were clever," he said, "but not clever enough. Strip him." The guard seized Alexander, wrenching his coat aside, but he was faster. With a sudden twist, he dislodged one guard's pistol and fired it into the ground, creating a moment of confusion. He bolted toward the side door, bursting through it into the yard. He made it 3 steps before the butt of a musket slammed into his temple. The world spun. Darkness fell. When he awoke, the air was cold and damp. Stone surrounded him on all sides, slick with moisture. Chains bound his wrists. A single torch burned in a bracket above the heavy wooden door, the Tower of London. He was no longer simply a pawn in someone else's game. He was a prisoner. The days blurred together. Interrogators came and went, some with threats, others with smiles. None left with answers. Alexander remained silent. He knew that any word spoken could endanger Eleanor and the child. Pembroke could not know that the documents were now gone again, hidden elsewhere before he could be fully searched. And so, he endured. Until one day, a familiar voice called his name. "Alexander." He looked up from the corner of his cell. Sophia. She stood just outside the iron bars, wrapped in a cloak too fine for such a place, her expression torn between concern and disbelief. "You look awful," she whispered. He managed a smile. "Flattery suits you." She glanced over her shoulder, then leaned closer. "They're saying terrible things, that you've conspired to overthrow the crown, that you're hiding a royal heir." Alexander's smile faded. "I need your help," he said quietly. "More than ever." Sophia's eyes darted. "If they catch me here too long—" "Listen," he said. "There's a man, Captain Forrester. He's with a woman named Eleanor and a child. They're hiding at the old hunting lodge, deep in the woods beyond Northumberland. You must get word to them." Sophia hesitated. "Why? What good will it do?" "Because," Alexander said, his voice tight. "If I'm to die tomorrow, they'll need to know what I've hidden. The journal, the certificate. They'll need to protect the boy." Sophia's expression wavered. "Is it true?" she asked. "What they're saying? About the child?" He met her gaze. "Yes." She took a breath. "I'll go." Before she could turn away, Alexander pressed her hand through the bars, gripping it tightly. "Tell them not to run, not yet. There may still be a way." She nodded once, then disappeared into the corridor's shadows. Alone again, Alexander sank to the floor. The next morning came too quickly. Guards arrived at dawn, dragging him from the cell and leading him up the spiral steps into the grey light of day. He was escorted through narrow stone corridors into a grand chamber dressed for trial. The colours of the crown adorned the walls, officials lined the benches, and at the head of the room, beneath the royal insignia, sat Lord William Pembroke, a wolf in robes of justice. Alexander stood in chains before them all, and the accusations began. The courtroom was silent, save for the soft scrape of Alexander's chains as he was brought to stand before the tribunal. Sunlight filtered weakly through the high, stained glass windows, casting fractured light on the cold stone floor. The room reeked of authority and condemnation. At the center of it all sat Lord William Pembroke, draped in official robes, his expression unreadable. His voice rang through the hall like a judge and executioner wrapped in one. "Alexander Harrington," he said, "you stand accused of high treason, of plotting to install a false heir to the throne, forging royal documents, and conspiring with known enemies of the crown. How do you plead?" Alexander looked up, face battered but defiant. "Innocent," he said, voice steady. Gasps murmured through the gallery. Pembroke raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. "Then let us proceed. Bring forth the evidence." What followed was an elaborate theatre of lies. False witnesses were called, men Alexander had never seen, claiming he had sought their help to stage a coup. Letters were produced, forged in his handwriting, supposedly detailing a plot to crown a pretender. Gold coins were presented, said to be bribes. It was too well prepared, too rehearsed. A web spun tightly. The jury, composed mostly of Pembroke's allies, nodded along. It was all going exactly as he had planned. Alexander remained silent through it all, watching the machinery of corruption churn around him, until the doors burst open. All heads turned. A court official tried to block the entrance, but was pushed aside. Sophia stepped into the room, eyes fierce, her voice ringing like steel across the marble floor. "This proceeding is unlawful. The king was not informed." Behind her came Eleanor, cradling baby Thomas in her arms. Forrester followed, sword still strapped to his side, face grim. But the final figure made the chamber collectively inhale. King George himself. All rose in stunned silence. The monarch stepped forward, his gaze sweeping the room. He stopped at the tribunal bench. "Explain yourself, Pembroke," he said coldly. "Why am I only now learning that a peer of the realm is being tried for treason in my name?" Pembroke paled, but bowed low. "Your Majesty, the urgency." Silence. The king turned his gaze on Alexander. "What is this all about?" Alexander stepped forward, as much as his chains allowed. His voice was quiet, but clear. "Your Majesty, I have in my possession documents that may change everything." He reached into his coat where, thanks to Sophia's daring help the night before, the real documents had been returned to him. He handed the wrapped bundle to the nearest guard, who brought them to the king. "The journal of your niece, Princess Charlotte, and the original birth certificate of her son, Thomas." The king's hands trembled slightly as he opened the documents. His eyes scanned the writing, page after page. As he read, the tension in the room grew unbearable. He paused, then turned. "Summon the royal physician," he commanded. The chamber waited in uneasy silence until, minutes later, the aging man was ushered in. Dressed in formal black, spectacles perched low on his nose, he bowed deeply before the king. "Dr. Alwyn," the king said, "do you recognize these documents?" The doctor took them with reverence. His eyes widened as he saw his own signature on the certificate. "Yes, Your Majesty, these are authentic. I witnessed the birth myself." "And the child?" Dr. Alwyn stepped forward. Eleanor wordlessly placed Thomas in his arms. The doctor examined him gently, then looked up. "The eyes," he said. "Deep blue, flecked with silver. The same eyes as Princess Charlotte and her grandfather, King Henry." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Pembroke stood abruptly. "This is madness. Fabrication. A child born in secret cannot be proven royal." "Enough," the king said. He rose to his full height. "You told me she died childless. You told me the rumors were baseless. You said there was no heir." Pembroke's face twisted. "I acted to protect the throne, Your Majesty." "You murdered my niece," the king roared, "and you tried to erase her son from history." In that moment, Pembroke saw the shift, the power slipping, the fury of the king uncontainable. He turned, made for the exit, but Forrester was faster. He blocked the door, drawing his sword. Guards closed in. Pembroke struggled, but within moments he was disarmed, his robes torn, his mask of nobility shattered. The king stepped forward. "You will stand trial, a real trial, for murder, treason, and crimes against the crown." Pembroke said nothing, only stared at Alexander with loathing as he was dragged away. Then the king turned to the boy. He approached Eleanor, who stood still, uncertain. Slowly the king reached out and took Thomas in his arms. The child, calm and curious, looked up at the man. The king's expression softened. "My blood," he said quietly, "my sister's boy." He looked to the court. "Let it be known, this child, Thomas of Charlotte, is of royal lineage. He is under the protection of the crown from this moment forth." Gasps turned into cheers. The chamber erupted. Alexander, still in chains, swayed with relief. Eleanor, eyes brimming with tears, clutched Sophia's hand. Forrester allowed himself a rare smile. Moments later, a guard stepped forward and addressed the king. "Your Majesty, shall we remove the charges against Lord Harrington?" The king nodded. "He is cleared of all wrongdoing. Release him." The chains fell. Alexander rubbed his wrists, but his eyes were already on Eleanor. She stepped forward. Their eyes met. No words were spoken. But something passed between them. Not obligation, not gratitude, something deeper. 3 months had passed since the dramatic trial in London. The winds of change had swept across the kingdom, subtle yet irreversible. Whispers of a hidden heir born of Princess Charlotte were now accepted as truth, though few outside dares to speak of it openly. The court, ever shifting like sand underfoot, had moved on, some out of fear, some out of loyalty, most out of convenience. But far from the noise and eyes of the capital, in the rolling green of Durham's countryside, a quiet transformation was underway. The small, time-worn property that Alexander had once come to repossess had changed. Its broken shutters had been replaced, its ivy-covered stone walls scrubbed and repaired. A new wing had been built, modest but elegant, with enough space for books, maps, and even a nursery filled with laughter. What once felt like a place of exile now bore the soul of a sanctuary. In the garden, the late spring sun stretched golden fingers across the earth, and flowers swayed in the breeze. Eleanor walked beside Alexander along the gravel path, her steps slow, deliberate, as if trying to hold on to the moment. Ahead, under the vigilant eye of Forrester, who now bore the relaxed air of a soldier without war, young Thomas played in the grass, babbling to a wooden horse with royal insignia, carved faintly into its flank. "You could have taken any title," Eleanor said softly, glancing sideways at Alexander. "The king would have granted you estates in the south, lands far more valuable. A seat at court, a barony even." Alexander shrugged lightly, hands behind his back. "I've had titles before, lands, favors. They never felt like anything more than rented masks." He paused. "But this is the first place in years that feels like a home." They walked in silence for a while, letting the sounds of birdsong and rustling leaves fill the space between their words. The gravel crunched beneath their boots, the air warm and scented with rosemary. Eleanor stopped under an old oak tree, its trunk wide enough to cradle shadows even in full daylight. "What happened to you, Alexander?" she asked. "Back then, when you opened that door for the first time, you weren't just an agent of the crown. Something changed." He didn't answer immediately. His gaze followed the sway of the branches above them. Then, slowly, he turned to her. I saw a woman willing to fight, to lie, to run, for a child that wasn't hers by blood, but by something far greater. I saw courage, Eleanor, a kind of loyalty I thought had died in me. His voice softened. And then I saw that child. I saw innocence, legacy, hope, everything I thought the world had beaten out of me. He took a breath, as if lifting a burden from his chest. I came here to destroy something. Instead, I found something worth protecting. And in that protection, I found myself again. She looked at him for a long moment, something unspoken blooming behind her eyes. The laughter of Thomas broke the silence as he crawled toward them, his tiny hands slapping the grass. Forrester, standing not far off, gave a rare, amused huff and let the boy go. Thomas was swift on all fours, determined to reach his audience. Alexander bent down and scooped him up into his arms. "Hello there, little sovereign," he murmured, bouncing the child gently. Thomas giggled and grabbed at his coat button. Eleanor smiled, watching the man who had once come with orders to displace her, now carry the child like he was his own flesh and blood. "Sometimes," she said, "I forget how strange it all is, that this little boy, this quiet piece of land, might have changed the course of the kingdom." Alexander nodded. "And yet the world keeps spinning," he said. "Crops grow, birds sing, the world forgets quickly." "But we won't," she said, her tone steadier now. "Not this garden, not this home." He turned to face her more fully, still holding Thomas. The baby reached toward her, and she placed her hand on his back. "What do you see now?" she asked. "When you look at us?" Alexander hesitated, then spoke, voice barely above a whisper. "I see a future I never imagined. One not built on vengeance or duty, but on choice." They stood like that for a while, three souls woven together by chance, by fate, by decisions made in desperate hours. The sun dipped lower behind the trees, casting long shadows over the grass. In the distance, smoke curled lazily from the chimney of the house. Somewhere inside, a kettle boiled, and the scent of rosemary bread drifted from the kitchen. "I never asked," Eleanor said gently, "what happened to your family?" He looked away for a moment, then back. "There was a fire, a carriage accident, my wife, my daughter, gone in a blink." Eleanor reached out and touched his hand. "I'm sorry," he gave a small nod. "It hollowed me out," he said. "I stopped believing in things like love, in things like redemption. I became very good at carrying out orders because they gave me no room to feel." He looked down at Thomas. "But this child, and you, reminded me what it means to feel again." A warm breeze passed between them. Eleanor leaned her head against his shoulder, and Thomas nestled contentedly between them. They stood beneath the oak tree, the last light of day wrapping them in gold. In that stillness, in that quiet, there was no need for declarations or promises. Everything was understood. A bond not written in parchment or forged in royal courts, but born of fire, truth, and shared survival. Later that evening, as dusk fell and stars peeked through the violet sky, the family walked back toward the house. The silhouette of the three of them, the tall protector, the resilient mother, the child who would one day inherit a truth too vast for his small hands, stood framed against the dying light. And in that moment, the house Alexander had once come to destroy stood tall behind them. It was no longer a house, it was home. Were you touched by this message? Like it now, subscribe to the channel and share it. Someone needs it today, and that click could change everything.